So recently I took a slightly more scientific which character are you personality test, and my highest match of all 2,000 possible characters was, well, This is probably the most unambiguous sign I need therapy that I've ever seen. These results were well timed though, not only because at the time of writing this, the second season of Loki is soon to air, but also because earlier this year I did a run-through of all the MCU films up through Endgame for my first time. That's right, for my first time. Because while I have been a Loki fan ever since his brief stint as a Norse trickster god and his all-time classic "Oops, I stirred again," I have always had a love-hate relationship with the MCU. Lots of fun films, but I resent being strong-armed into watching every single one just to understand the films that I do want to invest time into. So, once the required reading got too demanding for my tastes about halfway through Phase 2, I stopped watching. For me, the main draw to the Marvel films always has been Loki, Thor, and their own love-hate relationship. The family drama between these two and Thor drew me back to theaters for the first Avengers film and even the oft-criticized Thor: The Dark World. But the conclusion to this Thor trilogy wasn't to come for another 4 years and chronologically something like 11 more films. When Thor 3 finally came out, I felt so far behind that as much as I wanted to see it, I never did. I literally bought the Blu-rays and never watched them. Until now. So, after many years and sitting through 19 films, I finally watched the widely acclaimed Thor Ragnarok for my long-awaited first time. And I did not expect this film to fall on both sides of my love-hate relationship with the MCU, because I have had quite an emotional process with this movie. From first fully enjoying the film, but having a gut feeling that something was very wrong, to being livid upon learning that the soulless parts of the film that fly in the face of what we usually consider good writing craft were seemingly an intentional act of sabotage. I realize I'm late to the game, and much of what I have to say has likely been said before, but I thought it might be interesting for a writer, especially one who was removed from all the hype, promotion, and fandom surrounding Ragnarok's release, to give their perspective so many years after the fact. For this, I knew I wanted to do a rewrite of the film, which in turn kind of requires me to discuss what I thought the problems were. But with the internet being the internet, I need to make it abundantly clear that if you're one of the many, many people who enjoyed this film, who didn't notice the issues, or who did but didn't care about them, first, be warned that I am going to be critical in this video, but second, and more importantly, this isn't about convincing you to stop loving something that gives you joy. I wouldn't want to try. But this is first and foremost a writing channel where we pick apart writing craft and attempt to improve our own writing. And the writing for this film has some hiccups worth learning from. If you can't handle criticism of the film, that's okay, but for both our sakes, maybe skip the video then. I also think that it's important to point out before we begin that we are going to be talking about the writing specifically for the films, not the comics. Adaptational faithfulness is a whole other issue we are not getting into today. The films and the comics are separate entities with separate stories, and we're purely going to look at how the films stand or fall based on their own merit. For those of you sticking around, this will be a 2-part discussion. Next time I'll discuss my rewrite for the film, but for now, let's talk about this love-hate thing I have going on with Thor Ragnarok. Make no mistake, as much as I will later criticize this film, I really did enjoy most of my first watching. There are many good reasons people love it. Ragnarok is interesting to me because I would kill Daddy Frost Giant to get my hands on an iteration of this script that existed before production went into full swing. You can tell that someone involved on the writing staff knew exactly what this film needed to be, but either couldn't quite get it to work the way they'd hoped, or they didn't have the authority to stop someone higher up in the production from interfering with the story. Since Waititi has suggested as much as 80% of the film went off script, I'm guessing it was the latter. But there are tiny little nuggets of what the film needed to be scattered all over the place, which suggests to me that there used to be a solid spine to the story before changes were made that broke all the vertebrae apart. If you found yourself enjoying the bits and pieces of good character arcs, good themes, or a sensible plot, you might be picking up on the ghost of something that was once very alive. Because there is a great story here somewhere, and one or all of these writers poured their hearts into this film and deserve credit for a job well attempted. One of the main reasons people love this film, and certainly why I enjoyed much of my first watch, is because Taika Waititi's got an endearingly irreverent sense of humor. If you appreciate a laugh more than an exemplary execution of literary craft, then it's easy to enjoy this film. If you divorce Thor Ragnarok from the wider MCU storyline and take it on its own, the film is entertaining. For many, it was a welcome reprieve from the darker turn Marvel films had taken at the time with its ability to not take any of its characters or even the previous Thor films too seriously.
I have been falling for 30 minutes!
It's wacky, it's fun, it's colorful, it's stylish, it's got hijinks and my boys Thor and Loki. While this film didn't give me quite as much brotherly love and hate between our boys as could satisfy someone as thirsty for it as me, sometimes their scenes together hit the spot. I laugh at Matt Damon, Luke Hemsworth, and Sam Neill putting on this ridiculous play every time. I'm delightfully in awe of how wonderful Anthony Hopkins is playing Loki, playing Odin. Cate Blanchett plays Hela with deliciously wicked style. Jeff Goldblum summons maximum Goldbluminess in his portrayal of the Grandmaster. And I don't think I could possibly express how much Loki and Bruce Banner / the Hulk's mutual terror of each other delights me. Basically, it's an exceptionally well-cast film. Ultimately, this film is fun moment after fun moment. Not every film has to be serious drama. When I think of this film as a really long SNL sketch, I can love it. But funny and well-written are not the same thing, and I feel that the jokes and the exceptional cast mask weaker aspects in the writing. The more time passed after I'd first watched this film, the more things fell apart for me. The more things I'd once laughed at nagged at me. Which brings me to that gut feeling I had during my first watch. That feeling in between laughs that there was something a bit sinister going on beneath the surface. Because I have seen Waititi's work before. I know when he's invested, his films are capable of weaving a consistent theme through an otherwise silly presentation.
The humble little bunny faces a dangerous world every day, hunting carrots for his family, for his country.
I know his films are capable of depicting characters with depth and nuance, heart and humanity amidst their ridiculousness. I know Waititi knows how to hold back the laughs when a scene demands seriousness. So, where was all that in Ragnarok? Perhaps the biggest problem this film has is that it isn't a spin-off or SNL sketch. It isn't isolated from the other films and was supposed to conclude a series that told a cohesive story. Once you realize that, you realize this film has a lot more problems than one. Thor Ragnarok is not only not a standalone comedy, it's the climax of the first arc of Thor films, the climax to Thor and Loki's relationship before Loki's untimely death at the hands of Thanos. As such, this film had some heavy lifting to do, but unfortunately, it skipped leg day. In the writing world, we often talk about knowing your audience. Genre and tone are a massive part of attracting an audience and managing their expectations for your story. If you attract a certain type of audience by beginning a series in one genre and tone, you risk alienating the very people supporting you if you switch things up partway through. If you think a Game of Thrones fans were frothing at the mouth after the final season, just imagine how much angrier they'd have been if the finale had turned into a Hallmark holiday special. Genre and tone matter. Going from Thor and the Dark World on to Ragnarok is tonal whiplash. It's the equivalent of taking Peter Jackson's The Return of the King and swapping it with a version of the film where the same cast perform vacuous Lord of the Rings memes they scraped from the depths of the internet for 3.5 hours. That version of the film might very well be hilarious, but that also doesn't matter, because as the climax and conclusion to Jackson's take on the trilogy, it would have fundamentally failed to do the thing that it existed to do: properly conclude the trilogy. My friends, I give to you Thor Ragnarok, the 2-hour meme. Thor, the Dark World, and the Thor and Loki scenes together in the Avengers were very Shakespearean character pieces. For all that these films have flaws, for all that they have moments of levity, they still mostly maintained tone. And maybe you don't like that Shakespearean tone. Maybe you vastly prefer Waititi's comedic take on the characters and believe that he's rescued them from monotony and pretension. Okay, some do feel that way. But then I think you need to consider that maybe you weren't the right audience for a Thor trilogy as begun in 2011. And it's not you who should have been catered to in the conclusion to that trilogy, but the audience who was already attracted to and supporting the series. When you look at these films as the series they are, Ragnarok betrays the audience that was targeted through the Shakespearean lens through which Thor and Loki's story was told. It breaks the promises those earlier films made about what to expect from the story, distills nuanced characters into largely one-note caricatures, and resolves deeply dramatic loose ends with insouciance. It deflates the poignance of the prior films and undermines them, which, as it turns out, was probably the point. So I want to be careful not to make any personal attacks here or to rely too much on conjecture, but we've got to talk about Taika Waititi. While it must be made clear that the suits at Marvel share responsibility for the tonal shift Ragnarok made, as they specifically sought to change things up and gave Waititi their support in the direction this film took, in my opinion, Waititi has a particular style that was never appropriate for the aforementioned tone that a Thor 3 film needed to properly conclude the trilogy. But beyond style differences, Waititi himself has spoken about these characters and the previous films in such a way that it becomes difficult to believe he holds anything but disdain for them. He has spoken of refusing to do his research because of that distaste he has for the comics. He appears to have a deep dislike and misunderstanding of the characters. He especially does not seem to like or understand Loki, and that's an unpardonable offense. But he also seems to lack respect for the previous Thor films, and speaks of Ragnarok not as the continuation and resolution of those films, but as their destruction, as the new Thor 1. He wants to disregard and disrespect those films while at the same time inheriting and profiting off their audience. He doesn't find the characters relatable and doesn't think you should either. In fact, he has spoken of altering scenes to reduce the audience's emotional investment when test audiences started to feel feelings for the characters. He has spoken of intentionally disrupting scenes he knew full well should have been emotional experiences for the audience. He has spoken of not really caring about whether the plot of Ragnarok made sense or whether it fit in with the rest of the lore of the MCU, claiming it was Marvel's problem to make sure he stayed in line, while also admitting that he would hide his intentions for the script from the studio because it would require too long to get approval and he was having fun screwing around. When you read these kinds of comments from Waititi, a lot of the jokes in Ragnarok start to feel spiteful. At least for me, it's a lot harder to find the jokey jokes funny when you feel you and your love of the characters are the butt of them. Speaking of jokey jokes, many have spoken about Marvel's problem with humor, especially how its frequent misapplication of bathos can mess with the audience's emotional experience with the story. But Ragnarok takes its humor problems to a new level, where nothing is too sacred to obliterate in the service of even a bad joke. Let's be clear, there is nothing wrong with a movie being funny. There isn't even anything wrong with a comedic Thor film, so long as it's a spin-off and not the conclusion to a trilogy with a pre-established Shakespearean tone. Humor, camp, and good storytelling are not mutually exclusive. Just look to Barbie for proof that a well-written comedic narrative will use the humor to enhance character and plot, not take away from them. Most of the jokes in Barbie are used to reveal who the characters are.
To be honest, when I found out the patriarchy wasn't about horses, I lost interest anyway.
How they see the world.
She thinks I'm a fascist? I don't control the railways or the flow of commerce?
or to emphasize aspects of the theme central to the story.
I'm a man with no power. Does that make me a woman?
It's funny, it's campy, it's in character, and it's well written. Unfortunately, rather than taking the care to write jokes that would be in character, the characters and plot of Ragnarok are written inconsistently so as to make the jokes work. To give you an example, let's do something that you should normally never do, and seriously overanalyze this comedic exchange between Thor and Loki.
How was I supposed to know? Can't see into the future, I'm not a witch.
No? Why'd you dress like one?
Hey.
Okay, so it's safe to say this is not the strongest example of comedy in the film, but that's actually kind of the point. This is one of those lowest hanging fruit situations in which the punchline is supposed to be that Loki is goth, because that's Waititi's headcanon. But while goth in the real world is diverse and sometimes loosely defined, pop culture relies on very specific goth stereotypes to communicate humor to an uninitiated audience. Yet even by those low standards, unless he's a secret Susie and the Banshees fan, Loki actually falls into very few of those stereotypes. In fact, Waititi's own film doesn't introduce Loki as goth. So this joke is ultimately less a joke for the audience to appreciate than it is for Waititi to laugh at his own headcanon. Now, I don't say any of this to suggest that you're stupid if you laughed at the delivery. What I am trying to say is that this isn't really the caliber of joke that's so funny you would regret cutting it from the script if it was causing problems in your story, right? Yet, in Ragnarok, the characters had to break character for this exchange. One could argue this exchange is out of character for both of our brothers. We have seen from deleted scenes before that when Thor tries to belittle Loki, it is Loki's trickery and magic he attacks.
How else could I have fought my way through 100 warriors and pulled us out alive?
As I recall, I was the one who veiled us in smoke to ease our escape.
Yes. Some do battle, others just do tricks.
Though that scene depicts the arrogance Thor was supposed to character arc his way out of, meaning Thor should be above these kinds of slights by now.
You know what we call you? We call you the Stupid Avenger.
Still, I could have my arm twisted into accepting this regression in Thor's character in a moment of extreme frustration. But as an 84% certified Loki variant, I feel qualified to tell you that the real problem here is Loki. Loki has insecurities galore, but two of the things we get the sense he has genuine pride in are his fashion and his magic. Another thing we know about Loki is that when he is feeling hurt or insecure, he prefers to hide that. So it just doesn't seem likely Loki would be offended by this joke in the first place. But if he was, he would certainly not respond with,
Hey.
Speaking of emotional upsets. This point is closely intertwined with my point on humor, but there were so many places in Ragnarok where I came out of a scene thinking, is that all we're gonna get? The comedic tone meant the characters were always holding themselves back from expressing any kind of emotion not immediately designed to get a laugh out of the audience. Not because they were struggling to keep heavy emotions under control, like this scene from The Dark World. That would at least have been interesting and revelatory. But instead, the characters mostly went through the film either overreacting for laughs,
You know what we call you? We call you the Stupid Avenger.
or else underreacting, in a state one step above apathy. Loki even speaks cavalierly about his own attempted suicide.
At that moment, I let go.
A devastating and emotionally charged moment from the first film. But throughout the film, anytime the characters started to feel a modicum of something real, the plot quickly threw in a distraction to prevent the fruition of genuine emotion. One of the most obvious places this happens is during the scene where Asgard implodes. When you compare the destruction of Asgard to the destruction of Vulcan in the Star Trek reboot, the difference between how these two films treat very similar scenes is astounding. While not a comedy overall, Star Trek absolutely has its moments of silliness.
Good God, man. What? Ah! What the hell's this?
But when one of their main characters lost both a parent and their home, Star Trek knew well enough to be emotionally sincere in a scene that called for emotional sincerity. Ironically, the character in Star Trek most known for not emoting was allowed to display more emotional distress than Thor or Loki. Now, Spock, use your words.
I feel anger for the one who took Mother's life. An anger I cannot control.
Good boy. In Ragnarok, on the other hand, Waititi deliberately throws in a Korg joke to distract you from feeling for the loss of Asgard.
Now those foundations are gone. Sorry.
Because Asgard is not Waititi's kind of party town. Now, there is actually a joke thrown into Star Trek, not in the scene where Vulcan is destroyed, but in a later emotional scene. But I want you to pay attention to the placement and the purpose of the joke. In Ragnarok, Korg cracks a joke right while Asgard is being destroyed, right in the middle of what should be a deeply emotional scene. And its purpose, as I said, is to distract the viewer before they have a chance to build a proper emotional response to this tragedy. By design, the viewer never gets to experience the full emotional impact. But in Star Trek, the joke is placed after Spock's emotional outburst.
Doctor, I am no longer fit for duty. I hereby relinquish my command based on the fact that I have been emotionally compromised.
After he's collected himself and left the room.
I like this ship.
You know, it's exciting.
The purpose of this joke is not to distract the viewer's investment in the scene, but rather to help the viewer release the tension they were allowed to build up in the first place. The joke exists to help the viewer calm down so they can transition into the next part of the scene and pay proper attention to what's happening now.
Well, congratulations, Jim. Now we've got no captain and no goddamn first officer to replace him.
Yeah, we do.
That bears repeating. The joke is not there to distract the viewer from the story, but to help the viewer focus on the story. It is not there to break up the scene, but to help guide the viewer through it. Whether you prefer the joke in Ragnarok or the joke in Star Trek is largely going to come down to your own personal sense of humor. But when it comes to using humor to facilitate the telling of the story, Star Trek has a much more skillful use of humor. But the distraction of Asgard is hardly the only scene in Ragnarok where the viewer's emotional investment is deliberately limited. Earlier in the film, we see the death of Odin get a similar treatment. We get a tiny, sad look from Loki. Thor mostly skips over taking in what happened to Odin and goes straight to being angry at Loki for it, but that's about the extent of it. This is not the reaction of a guy who's had daddy issues for a millennium, finally hearing the words he's wanted to hear from his emotionally neglectful father only seconds before his father bites the dust, where he won't have to take responsibility for his neglect nor do any work to rebuild a relationship with Loki. And it's hard for me to believe Thor when he says,
I mourned you, I cried for you.
When he doesn't even seem to like Loki in this film. And we barely get to see him mourn for people we do know that he loves and idolizes, like Odin or his murdered besties. These reactions to Odin's death are significantly reduced to begin with, but then Hela shows up to interrupt and distract from even that emotionality. Now, there are ways to withhold emotional catharsis from your characters if you don't want those feelings resolved too early. You can interrupt an emotional outburst in ways that build the tension rather than deflate it. Look no further than the first Thor film for that. In Loki's argument with Odin, upon learning his father kept his true parentage from him, Loki is hurt and angry and self-loathing and confused. He lashes out at Odin, who in his weakened state is overcome by the strength of Loki's distress. This is an interruption of an emotional scene, but it's one that complicates Loki's struggle. Not only because Loki now thinks of himself as a
monster parents tell their children about at night,
was in part the cause for his father's collapse and is terrified of hurting him, but also because the one thing that might have prevented Loki from going down his path of villainy, being able to hash things out with Odin and hear that his father loves him, is withheld from him. Loki's complicated emotions are not dispelled or reduced by this interruption. They fester, they become dangerous because they don't have an outlet, and they directly contribute to Loki's horrifically violent mental breakdown and tragic fall from grace.
At that moment, I let go.
This is where I feel the need to stress a point I made earlier, that the tonal shift this film made is a problem, not just a style choice. Because that tonal shift makes almost every other issue in the writing worse. Treating heavy topics with levity wouldn't have been such a problem if the Thor films had always been emotionally diluted comedies. But for a series of films that started out as Shakespearean family dramas, these kinds of scenes in Ragnarok necessitated more emotionality to satisfyingly wrap up the family drama set up in earlier films. Thor and Loki barely reacting to their father's death wouldn't have felt nearly as disappointing and anti-cathartic if the prior films had not set high, dramatic, emotional expectations with scenes like this.
Tell me!
Or this.
You are an old man and a fool!
Or this.
I could have done it! For you!
Or this.
Your birthright was today!
Concluding that intense, melodramatic father-son family drama with this comparably inert scene just isn't appropriate. If Ragnarok wasn't interested in giving these scenes the heart and depth they deserved, then those scenes probably shouldn't have been part of the film at all, and this film, again, should have been a spin-off instead of Thor 3. I'm going to keep saying it. This is just a very hollow conclusion for those who actually cared about the journey these characters began in Thor. Speaking of journeys... Early on, the film sets up what the story is about. Thor and Loki coming together in perfect bro unity, repairing their relationship in order to stop Hela and Ragnarok from destroying Asgard. It's why the early scenes show us how Thor and Loki don't get along, so that when Odin tells them they need to stop Hela, we, the audience, understand that means that they're going to need to overcome their differences in order to succeed. Yet, almost as soon as the film sets up the purpose of the story, it promptly derails, because soon after we learn of Hela's existence, the brothers are separated, making it just a little bit challenging for them to learn to be proper bros. And we also get spirited away to the world of Sakaar, which is a setting that ultimately is just one giant distraction from the brothers' conflict with Hela. It's a silly place, deserving, perhaps, of its own spin-off film, but as a setting for this story, Sakaar is almost completely irrelevant. While there are a few plot-relevant things that happen on Sakaar, such as Thor recruiting the Hulk and Valkyrie as allies, that's really only important for explaining how the Hulk and Valkyrie end up in Infinity War, a completely different film. Neither of those characters is critically important to a story about Thor and Loki defeating Hela. I mean, literally the point of Sakaar is that
Sakaar lives on the edge of the known and unknown.
It isn't connected to anything. Not to Hela, not to Asgard, not to anything important to this story. It's in its own bubble. Ragnarok is an isekai anime. It's a portal fantasy. Here's the thing about portal fantasies, though. While the new world the main characters visit may initially seem disconnected from the world and the problems they left behind, the portal world is specifically designed to challenge and reshape the characters into the people they need to be to face those problems when they return. In other words, Sakaar should be specifically challenging Thor and Loki in ways that will thrust them through their character arcs, draw the brothers together, and prepare them to face Hela. But that's not really true of Sakaar. This film is supposed to be about Thor and Loki ironing out their differences, and yet, rather than Sakaar forcing Thor and Loki together where they must do exactly that to survive this strange world, Sakaar separates them from each other for almost an entire hour of the film. They're really only forced together for about the last 6.5 minutes of their time on Sakaar. When you tally all their time together on Sakaar, in the hour and 10 minutes spent there, Thor and Loki spend less than 9 minutes interacting with each other. And that's if I'm being generous about the definition of interacting. Thor spends far more time ironing out his relationship with the Hulk than he does with Loki.
We call you the stupid Avenger.
You're tiny Avenger!
It's not wrong for Valkyrie or the Hulk to be in this film or have some character development of their own or even have important things to do in this plot. But once they start taking over Loki's role in the film, that is a problem. This is not an Avengers film. This is not really the place for major interpersonal Avengers drama. I don't mind if Valkyrie and the Hulk visit, but they need to remember whose house they're in. This is a Thor film, and Thor and Loki's relationship was set up as being the central relationship to this film, just as their relationship has always been the primary relationship at the heart of the Thor trilogy. If Thor and Loki really must be separated on Sakaar, then a proper portal fantasy would have depicted them struggling alone and forced them to realize they're better together. There should have been scenes specifically showing Thor getting into problems he struggled to get out of, but that Loki wouldn't have. There should have been scenes specifically showing Loki getting into problems he struggled to get out of, but that Thor wouldn't have. Thor should have been forced to realize he benefits from Loki's cunning and counsel. Loki should have been forced to realize he benefits from Thor's virtue and leadership. And maybe, if we're lucky, they both could have realized they kind of miss each other, and that they could use each other's companionship and brotherhood as they grapple with their father's death in their own way. Instead of having Thor and the Hulk iron out their differences, it should have been Thor and Loki, and they needed a lot more than 6.5 minutes to do it. But, again, Sakaar doesn't facilitate any of this. Sakaar and the Grandmaster don't have anything to do with, well, anything. They're a distraction from the main plotline, and we spend over half of the movie there. This means that we don't get the proper time to develop Hela as a character, to build up her rivalry with Thor and Loki, or to see how she challenges Thor and Loki and forces them to grow in thematic ways. The film isn't invested in building up the conflict between Thor, Loki, and Hela, and Hela is the main antagonist of the film. Which brings me to my next point. Hela is beautiful, powerful, confident, hypnotizing in her suave and depraved cruelty. She is a destructive tour de force, resplendent in her malicious ambition. She could also be replaced with a sentient soggy waffle and have just as much impact on Thor and Loki. Hela is a villain Thor and Loki must overcome, to be sure, but she could be any villain. Any other villain in the MCU. She could be my left foot and still have as much narrative value. Remember when I said that prior to this film, Thor and Loki's story had always been portrayed as a Shakespearean family drama? Okay. Are you now going to tell me that in this Shakespearean family drama, Thor and Loki's callous father, they both have their respective issues with, meekly informs them in the moments before he expires that they have an iniquitous sister Odin somehow managed to keep secret despite the fact she literally helped him bathe the Nine Realms in blood during a colonialist war many are still alive to remember, and that this terrifying secret sister is about to unleash an apocalypse upon their home, and that Thor and Loki must somehow stop her as a last act of familial loyalty to said authoritarian father. And you're going to tell me that this all-powerful goddess of death who can't stop talking smack about daddy is the root of almost zero Shakespearean family drama? How? Hela shows up, breaks Mjolnir, and then proceeds to have no interactions with Thor or Loki. No particular influence, power, or hold over them until they show up to pull her down from her ill-gotten throne. By spending all their time on Sakaar, Thor and Loki are removed from conflict with Hela. Most of the times Hela does yank ghosts out of Odin's closet, confessions that should cause family drama. Thor and Loki aren't around to hear or be affected by it. Waititi, you have Cate Blanchett in your film. Use her! Hela is Thor and Loki's sister in a family with more issues than every print run of the Thor comics combined. She should be a bomb going off in Thor and Loki's family dynamic. If this film is supposed to be about Thor and Loki learning to be proper bros, then Hela's very existence should threaten their bond with each other, while also being the catalyst that causes them to strengthen that bond. The film could have had them question whether they have what it takes to kill their own sister, whether they should kill their sister. If she's beyond redemption, then is Loki beyond redemption too? And if he's not beyond redemption, what is the difference between them? Show that to us. In a film that's already trying to show Odin in a bit of a bad light, why doesn't Hela's existence force Thor to reflect on the possibility that maybe, just maybe, Odin wasn't as great a king or father as he believed? Why doesn't Hela's existence force Thor to consider that maybe there has been some truth to Loki's complaints of favoritism? I'm not saying the film has to cover all of this by any means, I'm just saying that they had options with Hela. Juicy, juicy options. Even if Hela can't be in every scene with them, and she can't, she should still be a looming presence whose actions directly interfere with their lives. She should make things personal. Instead, Hela is akin to a stray dog that got loose in the house while the owners were on vacation. She's knocking things over, peeing on the carpet, killing Thor's pet guinea pigs. She's a nuisance, she's a very bad day, and maybe a large repair bill, but she doesn't directly challenge our brothers or their relationship in any really personal way. Don't bring someone as fabulous as Hela into your movie and then squander her potential. Don't bring an evil secret sister into the story unless she's going to dig up family drama. So earlier I said that Ragnarok had elements of a good story scattered throughout the film, and one of the places these elements appear is in Ragnarok's themes. There are hints of good themes in the film, but they often end up confused or oppressed due in part to inconsistent characterization and the disjointed nature of the plot. But what are the themes? Well, there are a few ways that we can find out. First, many screenplays follow what is called the Hollywood formula, in which there is a character referred to as the relationship character. This character is usually someone who is close to our protagonist. A friend, a love interest, a mentor figure, something like that, who either literally or figuratively goes along the journey with them. The relationship character is the character whom either expresses or has expressed to them the theme of the film through dialogue, usually in an early scene with the protagonist.
You can accept that your father was a pirate and a good man, or you can't. The pirate is in your blood, boy, so you'll have to square with that someday.
Conveniently for our search for the theme, Ragnarok has the relationship character and the scene in which they express the theme. So, let's take a look.
I know we've come to take you home.
Home, yes. Your mother, she calls me. Remember this place. Home.
If you're busy busting a gut from the jokes, then the theme here is a little bit subtle, at least at this part in the film. But the message that you're supposed to take away from these lines is that Thor and Loki's home is not what they think it is. That, as is later stated outright several times,
Asgard is not a place. Never was. Asgard is where our people stand.
Asgard is not a place. It's a people.
Our brothers are meant to learn that the home they need to save is not Asgard, but their people, and, notably, each other. Effectively, just as Frigga is Odin's home, our brothers are each other's home. Which makes it pretty egregious that a moment from now the brothers will be separated from each other for almost a full half of the film. The scenes they do have together, such as Thor deciding to give up on Loki only for Loki to later prove himself, could have had more impact if Thor and Loki had spent more scenes together, trying and failing in their own ways to connect with each other only for Thor to give up when Loki was almost ready to meet him in the middle. Again, someone on the writing staff knew this was needed, because the barest elements of this are there. Thor tries to connect with Loki when he first arrives on Sakaar. Shortly after, Loki comes to the prison and tries to connect with Thor. But neither of these scenes are given nearly the same weight as Thor's scenes with Valkyrie or the Hulk. half of the film just doesn't give a rat's patootie about building the relationship central to the theme. But another way to discover theme reveals to us a secondary theme in the film. If we look at the protagonists' and antagonists' ideologies and find the point where they differ, therein lies the theme. Because the battle between the protagonist and antagonist is almost always an ideological one. How the protagonist's ideology defeats the antagonist's carries a central message. For example, in Avatar: The Last Airbender, Aang represents a philosophy of mercy and forgiveness, while Ozai represents a philosophy of brutality and might makes right. Which is why the people who think Aang should have killed Ozai are missing the entire point the story was trying to make. It's vital Aang defeat Ozai at Ozai's mightiest, not through a brutal mighty act of Aang's own, not through using the Avatar state, but through an act of mercy. Because that's how the central theme of the story shines. Aang's mercy is proven superior to Ozai's brutality. So, what is Hela's philosophy then? Hela monologues about the good old days of Asgard, of how she and Odin made Asgard rich from their conquering and plundering. She sees this new, less bloodthirsty, less ambitious Odin as weak. She supports an ideology of ruthless ambition, expansion, and glory-seeking. So then, you would kind of expect one of two things. Either Thor and Loki initially agree with Hela but change their minds by the end of the film, or their ideology stands in opposition to hers from the beginning. Or, I suppose, third, one could support her position and change, and the other could be in opposition to her from the beginning. But neither of these scenarios really comes across. Loki may at first glance seem to take the former stance, initially supporting a glory-seeking take-what's-mine ideology, but softening his stance to side with Thor by the end. Yet, if anything, Loki actually changes to support Hela's ideology more, while being portrayed as a better person for it, because of these jokes in Loki's introduction. While Loki may have usurped power to get where he is, he's also currently content with what he has.
No. Thank you.
And he's even pulled back from controlling the other realms.
Yes, well, it is best to respect our neighbour's freedom.
Yes, of course.
Excuse that might be, but he's no longer seeking to conquer or for more glory than what he already has. Yet by the end of the film, he returns to reconquer what he can of Asgard in the service of seeking glory. As for Thor, when speaking with Valkyrie, Thor says that he declined the throne because he disapproved of what Valkyrie calls the throne, the secrets, the whole golden sham. But he declined the throne because
Loki, for all his grave imbalance, understood rule as I know I never will. The brutality, the sacrifice, it changes you.
even if Thor doesn't want to rule Asgard, he's never really expressed disapproval of the throne itself, of Asgard's history, or of Odin's use of power. He has expressed recognition of the need for a king to exercise occasional brutality. He has, including in this very film, referred to Odin as a wise king. He has shown shock, but never outright disapproval of the secrets Odin kept regarding Loki or Hela. In fact, Thor accepts Odin's explanation without question in both instances, referring to Loki's complaints against Odin as imagined slights, and deciding that Hela must indeed be evil and destroyed simply because Daddy said so. It doesn't sound like Thor has a problem with the throne, with secrets, or with how Odin used power. Thor largely idolizes his father, the once conqueror, and he even chastises Loki near the beginning of the film, effectively because Loki isn't authoritarian enough.
And what do I find with the 9 realms completely in chaos?
There is absolutely a conversation to be had about not leaving a power vacuum when attempting to return the control of lands back to their native inhabitants, but this film is not interested in that conversation. So it's a little bit weird then to paint Hela and Odin as bad leaders due to their imperialism, but then to also attempt to paint Loki, a character who was a victim of Asgard's imperialism, as a bad leader because he's not imperialist, while making Thor the hero when he's never made to unpack his adoration for his imperialist father. Another thing I find interesting about how Ragnarok handled its themes is that while a film certainly can have secondary themes that grow naturally out of the discussion surrounding the main theme, a 2-hour film typically does not have the time and space to devote to 2 equally main themes. Usually the theme expressed by the relationship character and the theme explored by the protagonists and antagonists' battle of ideology are the same theme. For example, in the first Thor film, the main theme centers around worthiness, particularly on what makes a person worthy of leadership and how a worthy leader chooses when and how to enter battle.
A wise king never seeks out war, but he must always be ready for it.
Odin, once again, is our relationship character expressing the theme, and the ideological conflict between our protagonist Thor and antagonist Loki is centered on worthiness and how they enter into battle. Thor must prove his worthiness to even be able to pick up Mjolnir and enter battle in defense of innocence. Loki attempts to prove his worthiness to receive Odin's love by taking up a throne he never expected to have, ruling in the brutal manner he believes Odin would approve of, and escalating an unrighteous war Thor started. In this film, the relationship character scene and the battle of ideologies are both about the same theme, which makes it much easier to focus the story. So it's strange to me that Ragnarok has 2 separate themes it seems to want to devote equal attention to. A little bit like how it wants to spend an equal amount of time with 2 unrelated villains. And as with Hela and the Grandmaster, that divided focus muddies the central message. And we find similar muddy waters when we look at the characters. Unfortunately, the biggest reason I wanted to see Ragnarok is also what I found one of the most disappointing aspects of the film. Much of that disappointment boils down to what I've already discussed, that Ragnarok is often wildly inconsistent with the films it was supposed to build upon. The characters are, at times, direct contradictions to how they were introduced in previous films in the series. Or, in Thor's case, he's actually too much like how he was first introduced to us, because he has had nearly a complete regression in his character. Thor is brash, rude, self-centered, manipulative.
This is what friends do, they support each other.
You're Banner's friend.
I'm not Banner's friend, I prefer you. No, I don't even like the Hulk. He's all like, smash, smash. I prefer you.
He expresses annoyance, but no moral quandary when he's informed he'll have to kill one of the Grandmaster's unwilling slaves.
Fine, then point me in the direction of whoever's ass I have to kick.
He cheerfully tortures his brother and leaves him stranded where he'll likely be executed. He only sets the gladiators free to suit his needs and then leaves them behind to potentially die. When Bruce Banner expresses fear that he'll be stuck as the Hulk if he turns again, Thor doesn't care about his comrade at all and immediately tries to convince Banner to Hulk up.
I just told you, if I turn into the Hulk, I am never going to come back again. No, and you don't care.
No, I'm putting together the team. The Hulk is the fire.
They did my bro dirty in Ragnarok. Thor is everything and worse than he was when Odin deemed him unworthy of Mjolnir. As for Loki, as an 84% living astral projection of Loki, I have to say that my alter ego was slandered in this film. And nobody comes for my blue baby icicle like that. In Ragnarok, Loki is presented as a pathologically backstabber who will gleefully stab Thor in the back the moment Thor's back is available for the stabbing. Thor tells us stories of how Loki has been constantly trying to kill him since they were children. This is corroborated by Waititi himself. Yet this stands in direct contradiction to what we know of Loki from the previous films. Loki sincerely loves his family. That's where his more disturbing traits grow from, a sincere love that has been traumatized by neglect and abuse. We've seen him in a close relationship with Thor when they were young. We've seen him saving or attempting to save Thor multiple times, even at the cost of his own safety, even within this very film. Even characters who dislike Loki still feel forced to defend him and admit they have no concrete reason to believe him guilty of letting frost giants into Asgard. The fact that they're right about it is pure coincidence. which suggests that Loki hasn't spent his whole 1,000 plus years of life being a menace and trying to kill Thor. He spent most of his life trying desperately to be lovable. While Loki has a complicated relationship with perfect loyalty, and has unquestionably harmed Thor, his betrayals usually happen only when he's backed into a corner, in survival mode, and is having a complete mental breakdown, or is being brainwashed by the scepter and manipulated by a megalomaniac. Even then, there's nothing gleeful about Loki's betrayals. Then we have Bruce Banner, whose whole internal crisis as a character in all the prior films he's been in has been that he's ever so conscious of the harm the Hulk is capable of, to the point where he has sought isolation and even tried to kill himself. Yet in Ragnarok, he spends 2 years murdering slaves for nothing more than the Grandmaster's entertainment, and when he's back to being Bruce Banner, he never asks what he did during those 2 lost years. Never asks if he hurt anyone, not even after he sees an entire crowd of people with Hulk paraphernalia, which probably should get him asking a lot of questions. Lastly, we have Valkyrie. She has no previous iteration in the MCU that she needs to be consistent with, and yet she too has some issues in her writing. Her sudden change of heart is never satisfyingly explained. One moment she's deeply antagonistic toward Thor and adamant she wants nothing to do with his plans. And the next time she sees him, she's buddies with him and wants to help his cause, only giving us the vague explanation that she can't run away anymore. Okay, but why can't she? The only thing that happens between those moments that could possibly explain her change in perspective is when Loki draws out her memory of her fight with Hela. But there's no reason this should change her stance. This isn't something she forgot and Loki suddenly helped her remember. This isn't new information to her that recontextualizes her situation. She literally recounted this same memory to Thor just a few minutes ago, so it doesn't make sense for this to change her mind now when it was the very reason she didn't want to help him before. But that's just the characterization of a few of our heroes. We haven't even looked at the character arcs. Because neither Thor nor Loki has a solid, sensible, complete character arc. When I was first planning the script for this video, I'd initially intended to go through both Thor and Loki's character arcs point by point and show how they're incomplete or don't make sense. But as I was making notes for that, I realized that alone could easily add at least another half hour onto an already long video. So instead, I'm gonna pick just one thing from each brother's arc that doesn't work for me. For Thor, a lot of his arc is about his loss of Mjolnir, his resulting struggle to make lightning, and how he fears he can't protect his home or be a wise king without his hammer, his connection to his father. But there are some problems with this, namely that the audience isn't made aware that this is what Thor's arc is about until very late in the film. Throughout the film, Thor does mention the loss of his hammer a few times, but we aren't given a real sense that this is more than an inconvenience for him and that he's actually having a true crisis over this loss. Korg does suggest losing Mjolnir sounds like it was akin to losing a loved one.
Sounds like you had a pretty special and intimate relationship with this hammer and that losing it was almost comparable to losing a loved one.
It's a nice way of putting it.
Which I initially thought was supposed to be a cool way of telling us that what Thor was really upset about was not Mjolnir, but the loss of his father. That his complaining about Mjolnir, a gift from his father and a moral compass that helps him know if he's on a path his father would approve of, was simply his way of expressing grief and uncertainty about how to live his life without his father's guidance. Really cool way to show that, right? But then I saw Thor Love and Thunder and realized Waititi just likes to make jokes about Thor having intimate relationships with his weapons.
What? We were just talking.
I used to spin it really fast, and it would pull me off the...
Oh my god, the hammer pulled you off.
So now I can't tell if this was brilliant storytelling or just another of Waititi's jokes. But regardless, apart from this line from Korg, the audience is never shown Thor having a thematic crisis about the loss of Mjolnir. We're also never told that he's struggling to make lightning without Mjolnir. In fact, we're never even told he's struggling to make lightning, period. He seems to use lightning just fine when he's fighting the Hulk. The earliest indication Thor is having trouble with his lightning is this scene, where he's only able to make sparks, but we're not told he's struggling to make lightning because of an internal conflict. As far as we know, it's because the obedience disc is interfering, or because he's overwhelmed by Sakaar, or heck, just because it's funny to watch him struggle. The first time Thor explicitly tells us he's having a thematic struggle with his lightning, that he's concerned he can't be a wise king without Mjolnir, is when he tells Odin, "I can't make thunderbolt and lightning very, very frightening without Mjolnir, papa." And that happens in the climax of his character arc. And that is way too late in the film to bring the audience on board. But now for Loki's redemption arc. One of the big issues I take with Ragnarok and the first season of Loki is that both entities seem to think the path to redemption for Loki must involve humiliation.
Classic. Still hate it? It's humiliating. No, not for me, it's not.
Abuse.
Just put this over here for you.
Being dismissed as unimportant.
Let's be honest, our paths diverged a long time ago.
And silenced.
I don't mean to impose.
Look, I get it. Sometimes it's fun to humble, arrogant, pretentious scoundrels.
And I will not be bullied by that!
But the way it's done matters, and this model of redemption for Loki has some serious problems. First, from a mental health standpoint, this is a problem, particularly for the Loki series, since it's trying to have a discussion on mental health.
I crave attention. Because I'm a narcissist.
Because Loki is at his very core traumatized, and you cannot fix a traumatized person by piling on more trauma. Depicting that to be the case is a very dangerous and irresponsible narrative. But even from a writing standpoint, this is still a big problem, because Loki's entire villainous arc begins because he's humiliated, abused, dismissed, and silenced by those who should most care for him. You do not point a character toward redemption by placing them in the same environment that caused their downfall in the first place. Loki has many things that he needs to take accountability for. This is not about me letting him off the hook or absolving him, but for him to even get to a place where he can be capable of redemption and accountability, he needs to have some healing of his own first. To this day, Zuko is often held up as the epitome of how to handle a redemption arc. But if you think for 1 second that he would have been capable of that without the unconditional love, understanding, patience, and guidance of Uncle Iroh, then you were not paying attention. For Loki, this means that rather than humiliation, abuse, dismissal, and silencing, he needs to first experience respect, unconditional love, acceptance, and being heard before he can start to turn his life around. It means Loki needed a lot less of this and a lot more of this.
Loki, I thought the world of you.
Now, I'm not saying that no character in the MCU is ever allowed to humiliate, abuse, dismiss, or silence Loki. There will be characters who will respond to him that way, and will have reason to, given what he's done in his past.
That was for New York.
I like her.
But if he's to have a true redemptive arc, if that's what they're going for, then the narrative itself cannot be one of those treating Loki that way. He needs to have someone who is a safe, nurturing space for him. He needs his own Uncle Iroh. And no, so far neither Thor nor Mobius count. While both of them say the right things at times, they're both also guilty of humiliating, abusing, dismissing, and silencing Loki. Sometimes all of them in the same scene. Yay! Editing Ray here to add in a few things. I know I've had a lot more criticism to give Ragnarok than praise in this video, so I wanted to end on a more positive note, even if I kind of have to cheat to do so, because this time what I love is the book. I'd intended to read this before I made the video, but it took so long to get here that I'm having to add in a few notes now. But the reason I tracked down a copy was because I'd heard it was closer to the original screenplay before Waititi was brought on board. Now, I can neither confirm nor deny if that's the truth, but I can say that there are several differences between this book and the film. The book only covers the events on Sakaar, which alters the structure of the story in several beneficial ways. It means that the story's focus isn't divided between Sakaar and the battle for Asgard, nor is it divided between two antagonists, because while Hela's arrival provides motivation for Thor to get off of Sakaar, Hela herself is not the antagonist of this book. Arguably, Thor and Loki don't even meet her. And that means that Thor and Loki being separated from conflict with her isn't a problem for this story. Furthermore, there's no indication given in the book that Hela is their sister, which means that the absence of her stirring up family drama is also not a problem for this story. The book also focuses on only one theme, the theme of home. But there's a shift in the framing of this theme in the book. Rather than Asgard is not a place, it's a people, the theme is instead about accepting a responsibility toward home rather than running away from it. First, this shift in the theme makes Sakaar actually relevant to the story. All of our main characters are running away from home in one capacity or another, and Sakaar acts as a temptation, a place to hide from the problems that they're trying to ignore. Sakaar tests their resolve to learn the lesson of the theme and accept that they have duties at home to return to. Second, this shift in the theme uplifts and focuses the character arcs for all of our main characters. In the book, rather than Thor's arc being about finding his true strength without Mjolnir, it's instead about him realizing that he's been running away from his responsibilities toward the throne, and as such, how he's just as responsible for his home's vulnerability to Hela as Loki is. As for Loki, his character arc is about going from wanting to stay on Sakaar, a place where people finally accept him for who he is, to admitting, or at least as close to admitting as Loki gets, that he's partly to blame for the danger Asgard faces and has a responsibility to help Thor put things right. In the book, Loki never betrays Thor, but genuinely offers his help, and the two leave Sakaar together, united in purpose. Then we of course have Valkyrie and the Hulk, who are both running away from home and past failures. Valkyrie's change of heart is explained in the book, where it's specifically upon learning Hela has returned that convinces her to return home, realizing that she has unfinished responsibilities that outweigh her desire to run away. And unlike the film, Bruce Banner asks several times whether he hurt anyone during his time spent as the Hulk. The book also remains much closer to the tone of the earlier Thor films, and to my pleasure, it handled Thor and Loki's brotherly relationship much better. While they don't really get more scenes together than they did in the film, the scenes they do have together usually have some heartfelt moments. And the book moves much more quickly through the scenes where they aren't together, which makes the time the brothers are separated on Sakaar feel much shorter. And rather than Loki having to submit to Thor in order for the brothers to be able to reconcile, in the book, both brothers express wrongdoing to each other and commit to work together going forward. Thor doesn't give up on Loki, but lovingly chides him into being better. Maybe it was just that I was still riled up over the film that this book felt so amazing to me. Maybe I'm overlooking more of its flaws than I realize. But it was honestly such a breath of fresh air and basically everything I hoped for in a proper conclusion to the Thor trilogy as begun in 2011. I hope this video didn't ruffle your feathers too much. I know this is a very beloved film for many, and I know that there are many for whom this is Thor and Loki at their best. And maybe hate is a strong word for some of the things I critiqued in this video, but after waiting so many years to watch the hyped conclusion to Thor and Loki's story, only to come away so disappointed, I had to unpack it all. In a way, this is some of that therapy I apparently need so very desperately. So, whether you adored or hated Ragnarok, if you stuck around to let me vent,
I'm honored.
Maybe with enough time and space, I'll be able to return to Ragnarok and enjoy it for what it is. There are moments in the film that even now, even with a critical eye, I still love.
So, last time I saw you, you were trying to
hate on Ragnarok.
Where are you at these days? It varies from moment to moment.
Just as Loki's hatred for Thor and Odin is only so intense because his love for them was just as intense, I gripe about these issues with Ragnarok only because I love these characters and their stories so very much, and because I really truly do think that there is a great story hidden below the problems in this film. I just wish all of us had gotten to see it. Which is why, in the next video, I'm going to attempt to resurrect the ghost of Ragnarok's past and see if it's possible for me to rewrite this film out of the hole it dug itself into. Keep an eye out for that. Now, I've by no means given up completely on the MCU or my 84% carbon copy.
No, maybe they're still good in you.
I actually watched the first season of Loki long before I ever saw Ragnarok, and while the writing for that show isn't perfect either, the shift from film to television, the closing of one arc of Loki's story and the beginning of a new one, and the fact that he's literally a different Loki, have all made it much easier to accept the differences in how his character is written, and to enjoy the show for what it does do well. I remain excited for season 2. In the meantime, to balance out this critical video, I've been thinking of doing a series of much shorter videos in which I take one scene from each of the Thor films. Yes, even from Ragnarok. And discuss why I love it and what I think it does well from a writing craft perspective. If you like that idea and want to hear me talk about Thor and Loki more, let me know you're interested down in the comments, and I might see about releasing those sometime after my rewrite video. But to end this video on a more cheerful note, I have posted a link to the Open Psychometrics personality test in the description. If you're interested, you should take it and let me know who your highest MCU match is. But for now, it is time for me to wrap up this very long video, so if you liked this video, you know the drill. Like, subscribe, do your thing, and I will see you next time.